I've decided to divorce Hans. On the first day I made up my mind, I threw away my wedding ring and bought a plane ticket. On the second day, I cleared out all traces of our marriage from the wedding house. On the third day, I went to pick up our child from school and bought him everything he wanted to eat. The little kid said with disdain, "Dad is going to marry Aunt Camilla. Are you scared? It's too late to try to please me now." I looked at his face, which was exactly the same as Hans'. There wasn't even a shred of reluctance in my heart. Trash should stay in the trash can with other trash. Since Camilla is willing to take it in, of course I'll let her have it. The determination to get a divorce came to me quite suddenly. That day, I still couldn't get through to Hans on the phone. Just like many times in the past 6 months, it was always his secretary who answered. "Sorry, madam. President Hans has instructed that his personal itinerary not be disclosed to anyone." But not long after, Camilla posted a set of photos on her social media account. I recognized the Bulgari wedding ring on Hans' hand at a glance. Camilla was Hans' first love. In the 5th year of my marriage to Hans, she was getting divorced and came back to the country. From the very first day she returned, Hans' heart was in turmoil. Actually, after hanging up the phone, I just felt a bit sad. The thought of divorce wasn't that strong yet. It wasn't until I suddenly fainted from low blood sugar. At that time, there were only me and George, who had just come back from school, in the room. I was unconscious for about 10 minutes and was woken up by the noise of him shouting while playing games. But George just glanced at me and then continued playing his game. I was feeling really bad and could only muster all my strength to ask him for help. "George, could you please get a chocolate for Mommy?" Hearing this, George stood up impatiently with his tablet in his arms. But he walked around me and went straight out of the bedroom. The moment the door slammed shut. Just that 1 second. I suddenly saw the light. Back then, George came into being because Camilla got married and Hans got drunk and had a one-night stand. I actually didn't plan to have him. The doctor didn't recommend it either, considering how much Hans had drunk that night. But he proposed to me and earnestly begged me to keep the baby. I had liked him for so many years. How could I bear to refuse? So I got married and had the baby. But now, the child I carried for 10 months and brought up with my own hands was so cold and selfish that it was truly chilling. So, why should I continue to endure this marriage for his sake? Hans still came back late at night. I wasn't asleep. I had been waiting for him. He seemed to be in a good mood. He took out a small box from his pocket and handed it to me. "See if you like it." I opened it. It was a bracelet. In the photos Camilla posted today, there was a very shiny necklace. If I'm not mistaken, this simple bracelet was a free gift with the necklace. But I didn't even feel sad about it. I even smiled at him. "It looks nice." Hans seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. "Glad you like it." When he came out of the shower, he handed me the towel as usual. I took it as I always did. When I was drying my wet hair to half dry, I suddenly stopped what I was doing. "Hans." I called his name softly. He sat still but raised his hand and grasped my arm. "What, you want it?" I smiled wryly. It had been 5 months since Camilla came back, and Hans and I hadn't slept together for 5 months either. Seeing that I didn't say anything, Hans simply turned around and pulled me into his arms. "Lucia." There was a growing heat in his eyes. He lowered his head, wanting to kiss me. But I pushed him away. "Hans." I smiled at him calmly. Every word I said was extremely peaceful. "Let's get divorced." "Divorce?" He was obviously surprised. "Yes, divorce." I broke free from his arms, took a step back, and stood still. "Because of Camilla?" Hans frowned impatiently. "You know she's getting divorced." "I'm just helping her out." His gaze suddenly stopped on my ring finger. The wedding ring was gone, and there was still a faint mark on my finger. "Lucia, you're a mother now. How can you be so capricious?" I turned around and walked away. "The divorce agreement is on the desk in your study. Take a look at the property division. I only want what I deserve. If you have no objections, please sign it quickly." "What about George?" There was already anger in Hans' voice. "Don't forget, he's my Hans' son. I grasped the doorknob, turned around, and smiled at him. Yes, he's of the Hans family. So, I won't fight with you over him. Lucia. Hans' face turned livid. What on earth are you up to? Because I've been neglected by you these days? I told you, Camila is getting divorced. I'm just helping her with the lawsuit. Also, George is only 5 years old. He can't do without his mother's care. Hans picked up his clothes with a cold face. I'll consider today's incident as you throwing a tantrum. I'll stay at the company's house for a few days. Lucia, when you come to your senses and realize your mistake, come and find me. The next afternoon, Hans received a call from the servants in the wedding house. Lucia had cleared out all of her things. And she, who had always been very affectionate towards George and had taken care of everything herself, didn't send him to school in person for the first time. He couldn't help but think of the divorce agreement Lucia had drawn up. It was clearly written in black and white that she didn't want custody of George. This greatly astonished Hans. Lucia had a difficult labor when giving birth to George. He was put in an incubator right after birth. After the confinement period, she started taking care of the child herself. In these 5 years, she hadn't left George for a single day. So, he didn't believe that Lucia would give up the child. So, the big fuss she was making this time was just because she was jealous of Camila. And the reason she was jealous was, of course, that Lucia was madly in love with him. Hans knew that she had been secretly in love with him for years. When he was in love with Camila back then, she was just an inconspicuous little girl. Later, he and Camila broke up due to a misunderstanding. When Lucia reappeared beside him, she had grown into a graceful young woman. It's hard to say whether that one-night stand after getting drunk was really an accident. Or if he was a bit attracted to her too. In the 5 years of their marriage, their married life had been quite harmonious, until Camila showed up. In these past few months, he had indeed neglected her a bit. But anyway, Lucia couldn't just casually mention divorce. So, he still decided to teach her a lesson. The servant called again. Mr. Hans, Madam has called a cab and said she wants to move out. Hans silently lit a cigarette. He then lowered his eyes to stare at the wedding ring on his ring finger. After a while, he said coldly, let her go. Tell her that if she takes one step out, she shouldn't even think about coming back. I went to pick up George an hour earlier. I also bought all the toys he wanted. All the junk foods that he wanted to eat, but I wouldn't allow him to. George didn't seem very happy. He wrinkled his little face and said with disdain, is it because you know Dad is going to marry Aunt Camila that you're scared? It's too late to try to please me now. He threw the toys on the ground one by one and stepped on them. He threw all the food into the trash can, then he looked at me triumphantly. If you dare to hit me, I'll tell Dad right away. I looked at his face, which was exactly the same as Hans. There really wasn't even a trace of reluctance in my heart. George. I touched his face for the last time. I won't bother you anymore. Let's say goodbye for good today. We'll never see each other again. What do you mean? George was a bit stunned and subconsciously wanted to pull me. But I avoided him and smiled at him again. It means I don't want you anymore. George was completely stunned. After a moment, a look of grievance seemed to flash in his eyes. But then, he glared at me fiercely. Who cares if you want me or not? Aunt Camila is 100 times better than you. Well, then let her be your mother. I raised my eyebrows indifferently. George, good luck to you. The plane ticket I booked was to Hong Kong. I had a great time with my best friend from school days for half a month. Until Hans called my friend. Lucia, George is sick and is crying to see you. I thought about it and said calmly, it's normal for kids to get sick during the season change. The Hans family has a family doctor and a private hospital. They'll take good care of him. Hans didn't say anything and hung up the phone directly. My friend asked me with a bit of pity, Lucia, do you really not want the child anymore? She knew how much effort I had put into George. I nodded, yes, I don't want him anymore. Then? Hans, do you still like him? In the past, just hearing the name Hans would make my heart race uncontrollably. But now, there wasn't even a ripple. No, I don't like him anymore. Really, I don't like him anymore. My friend couldn't help but cheer. Lucia, we must celebrate. Tonight, We'll drink until we're drunk. My first time with Hans was because of alcohol. Back then, I was sober and Hans was the drunk one. But this time, I was drunk out of my mind. The man in front of me was always sober and restrained even when he was helping me, he was a gentleman. My friend hesitated for a long time before coming over. Stephen, could you please send Lucia back? Stephen didn't reply. He helped me, who was almost limp, to sit on the sofa. I'll leave the driver for you. I'll drive back myself. Stephen. Are you really going to leave Lucia alone? Stephen's gaze was indifferent. I said 5 years ago that her affairs have nothing to do with me anymore. I suddenly laughed silently. Yes, back then Hans forced himself on me when he was drunk. Stephen was determined to call the police. But I was so in love that I finally chose to marry him. Stephen was my playmate. We grew up together. Because of what happened with Hans, he was extremely disappointed in me and cut off all contact completely. I didn't expect to meet him tonight. I heard that he had been abroad all these years and never came back. Who would have thought we'd meet in a bar in Hong Kong? I hid my embarrassment and called my friend softly. Helen, let him go. I can go back by myself. Stephen didn't say anything and turned around and walked away quickly. But when my friend helped me out of the bar, his Bentley was parked on the roadside with its hazard lights on. Stephen was leaning against the car, smoking. There were cigarette butts scattered all around him. Lucia. He smiled, but the smile was filled with indescribable bitterness. I must have owed you something in my last life. He helped me into the car. Then he arranged for the driver to take my best friend back. When the car arrived downstairs at the hotel where I was staying, Stephen parked the car and unfastened his seatbelt. Then he leaned over, pinched my chin, and kissed me. I was in a daze. Maybe it was the stimulation of the alcohol that made me lose my head. I actually wrapped my arms around his neck and reciprocated his kiss. Lucia. Stephen's kiss gradually deepened. His fingers ran through my long hair, clasped the back of my head tightly, forcing me to respond to him. When I was almost out of breath, he finally ended the deep kiss. He lowered his head, his forehead touching mine. Do you want it? Suddenly, I thought of the screenshot of the chat records I received a month ago. It was sent by Hans to Camila. Want to be with you again. At that time, I was worried about George and was deeply in pain and confusion. But now, I didn't care about anything. I directly tilted my face up and kissed him back, hooking my arms tightly around his neck. Stephen, let's do it. But Stephen grasped my shoulders and gently pushed me away. In the flickering light, his handsome eyes were extremely serious and focused. Lucia, I have a condition. What condition? I'm a kind of traditional man. Stephen lowered his eyes and smiled, his fingers on my shoulders trembling slightly as he tightened his grip. If we do it, you have to be responsible for me. When he said that, I sobered up a lot. Responsible. These 2 words were too heavy, and they directly hit the old wound in my heart. When Hans proposed to me back then, it was also about taking responsibility for the so-called drunken one-night stand. Seeing that I didn't say anything, Stephen chuckled. Lucia. He brushed away the messy hair on my forehead, lowered his eyes, and looked at me deeply. If you don't want to be responsible, don't provoke me. You know I'm not that kind of casual man. He gently pushed me away and got out of the car. Then he opened the car door for me. Get out. I'll take you back to your room. He stood there, tall but looking a bit aloof. With his back to the light, I couldn't see the emotions on his face, but I just felt inexplicably sad. Stephen sent me to the door of my room. After watching me go in, he left directly. I leaned against the back of the door and didn't move for a long time. I didn't know if it was the alcohol that made me feel bad, or it was the last look Stephen gave me when he left just now, and the last thing he said. He said, Lucia, my flight is at 3 o'clock this morning. I think I'll never come back again. Suddenly, the phone rang abruptly. My thoughts were suddenly pulled back. The incoming call number looked familiar, but I couldn't remember it for a moment. I picked it up, and it was the voice of another secretary of Hans. Madam. The secretary's voice sounded very respectful and cautious. Well, Mr. Hans had too much to drink at the business dinner tonight and just threw up. He didn't want to drink the hangover soup made by the servants, saying it didn't taste right. Madam, could you please come back? I directly interrupted him. If he doesn't want to drink the hangover soup, he can take the hangover pills. I'm neither a servant of the Hans family nor a doctor. Don't come to me for such things in the future. By the way, please also trouble yourself to urge Mr. Hans about the divorce matter. Madam. The secretary wanted to say something more, but was interrupted by Hans' angry shout. Who told you to call her? Jeremy, you're getting bolder and bolder. But Mr. Hans. Shut up. My affairs have nothing to do with Lucia. If you take the initiative again without permission, you can resign yourself. I was too lazy to listen to these anymore and hung up the phone directly. There wasn't the slightest ripple in my heart. I casually added Jeremy's number to the blacklist too. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I woke up suddenly for no reason. I scrolled through WeChat and found Steven's account. In the 5 years since I married Hans, we hadn't even sent each other a single festive greeting. But his profile picture was still the same one he had used for over a decade, a roughly carved little wooden puppet. One could barely make out that it was the shape of a little boy. It was the first doll I carved when I was inspired to learn wood carving. Later, I gave it to him. I stared at that profile picture and couldn't help but smile. But as I was smiling, I inexplicably started to cry. I sent a WeChat message to Steven. Steven, my tooth hurts so much that I can't sleep. The typing indicator quickly showed up at the top of the chat box. But no message came for a long time. Just when I was about to fall asleep from waiting, the WeChat notification sound rang. I bought you some medicine. The same city express delivery will send it to you soon. I was stunned for a moment before replying, oh. Steven didn't reply again. I held my phone tightly, but I wasn't sleepy anymore. However, there were no more messages from his side. After about 40 minutes, the doorbell rang. I got up a bit listlessly and went through to open the door. But when I opened the door, it wasn't the delivery guy standing outside. It was Steven, still looking a bit sleepy. Steven? I was stunned. He was still holding the bag of medicine in his hand, and there wasn't much expression on his face. Is it the same tooth that hurts? I nodded dully. He put down the medicine, turned around and went to the bathroom to wash and disinfect his hands. Open your mouth. Let me have a look. You're not a dentist. Lucia, which time did your toothache not get treated by me? After he said that, both of us were stunned for a moment. We hadn't seen each other for 5 years already. Steven's face was a bit cold, but his actions were extremely gentle. I was pressed onto the sofa by him. I tilted my face up and opened my mouth. His slender fingers skillfully felt for the wisdom tooth that often gave me pain. But actually, this one time, that tooth wasn't red, swollen, or inflamed. Steven looked at me. Then, slowly withdrew his finger. Lucia. He took a disinfectant wipe and wiped his fingers one by one. Then, he cupped my face and lowered his head. You tricked me. I didn't dare to look at me, my eyes darting away, not daring to meet his gaze directly. Sorry. Don't say sorry. Steven suddenly curved his lips into a smile. I'm happy. Steven? When I looked at him in surprise, he kissed me. I missed my flight. What should we do? This time I was going back to go on a blind date. Now, the potential wife is gone too. So, what should we do? What do you think, Lucia? Steven's fingers brushed away the messy hair on my cheek. He deepened the kiss bit by bit. Why don't you make it up to me? I've been married and had a child. It doesn't matter. I'm an older single man. I'll be satisfied if I can get a wife. I couldn't help but laugh. Steven, what kind of single man are you? The women chasing you could line up all the way to France. Steven looked at me deeply, but I'd rather be without than settle for less. Can't really tell. You'll be able to tell when I'm doing it with you in the future. I really didn't know that Steven's words were actually a double entendre at that time. Until our first time, he couldn't even wait to carry me to the bed. My knees hurt a bit from rubbing against the sofa. I couldn't help but bite him. Stephen, my knees hurt so much. His hot palm grasped my waist, and he held me and flipped us over. The position became that he was sitting leaning against the sofa, and I was sitting in his lap with my back to him. However, the moment I sat down, I felt his abdominal muscles tense up instantly. Even his breathing became rapid and heavy. Lucia, sorry, I can't hold it back a bit. Originally, I thought that his previous words meant that he wanted me to see his performance in the future. But I never expected that. He was nearly 30, but it was actually his first time. He hadn't had a girlfriend during all these years abroad. Stephen, you haven't been in a relationship during these years? I lay on the pillow, letting him clean my body. Stephen lowered his eyes, his actions gentle, but he didn't look at me and didn't say anything. Until he came out of the shower. He rarely took a cigarette and went to the terrace. When I went to find him, he was holding a cigarette between his fingers, looking at the distant sky, not knowing what he was thinking. Stephen. I gently hugged his waist from behind. What are you thinking? Thinking about whether you'll be responsible or just put on your dress and leave after we're done. I couldn't help but laugh. Am I that bad? He turned around to look at me, with a faint red in his eyes. You are. Stephen. I couldn't laugh anymore, and my eyes were aching and swollen. Yes, when he went abroad back then, I promised him that I'd marry him when he came back. But I fell in love with Hans, and then, in a muddled way, I had that chaotic night with him. Stephen. I hugged him tightly. I'll be responsible for you. Good. He hugged me even tighter and kissed me fiercely. Lucia, since you said you'd be responsible, you have to be responsible to the end. On the 30th day in Hong Kong, Hans still hadn't signed the divorce agreement. I was too lazy to wait any longer and directly sued him in court. On the day Hans received the summons, George's kindergarten teacher also called me. George's mom. George has been dozing off and getting distracted in class these days. I noticed that his mental state isn't very good and he's lost a bit of weight. I sighed softly. Thank you, Teacher Xia. You'd better contact George's father. George's mom, would you be convenient to come to the school? It's been a long time since we saw you picking up or dropping off George. Sorry, it's not convenient. That's okay. Sorry to bother you. When I was about to hang up the phone, I still couldn't help it. Teacher Xia, when George's father comes to pick him up, could you please ask him to pay attention to whether the child is secretly playing tablet games at midnight? George used to pretend to be asleep and then secretly play games at midnight. Once I caught him, and I was so angry that I threw his tablet. But not long after, on his birthday, he received several of the latest model tablets. Maybe he was afraid that I'd throw them again, so he restrained himself a bit and didn't dare to play secretly at midnight anymore. But now that I'm gone, Hans is busy with the company and Camilla's affairs every day. How could he have the energy and time to take care of him? Although I've decided to divorce Hans and don't intend to take George with me. After all, he is still my own flesh and blood. I don't want to see him completely ruined either. But, I'm just giving a kind reminder. Hans had never realized that disciplining a child could be such a tiring thing. After hearing what the kindergarten teacher said, he deliberately went to George's room in the middle of the night. After hearing what the kindergarten teacher said, he deliberately went to George's room in the middle of the night. George was having a great time playing and was so angry that he pushed him hard. It was only at this moment that he seemed to suddenly understand why Lucia had been so angry and disappointed back then, and why Lucia had had a huge fight with him when he bought George a new tablet again. He couldn't hold back and slapped George. George was obviously scared and cried for a long time, then he went to sleep alone, being good and quiet. But Hans didn't feel sleepy at all. He thought of the call that Jeremy made to Lucia that night. Actually, at first, he had acquiesced and didn't stop it. It was just Lucia's words and attitude that made him instantly furious. Because of Camilla, she had been so capricious and mischievous. It really gave him a headache. He thought that she was just using the divorce to blackmail him. And George was so disobedient due to his lack of discipline. Actually, these were all Lucia's tricks. She just wanted him to know her importance. Hans finished smoking a cigarette and took out his phone. He called her on his own initiative for George's sake. George was of the Hans family, but he was also the child that Lucia had risked her life to give birth to. As a mother, she couldn't just ignore her own child. But Hans never expected that. All of his contact methods had been blocked by Lucia. Even her best friend's phone number couldn't be reached now. Hans suppressed his anger and walked all the way downstairs. The night breeze blew, but he still felt that the anger in his chest couldn't dissipate. Lucia wanted to play for real, huh? Fine. Hans laughed angrily. She wanted a divorce, right? Then he'd let her have it. He couldn't wait to see now what kind of expression Lucia would have when he really signed the divorce agreement. Pretending had become a reality. She must be extremely regretful. After all, she had adored him so much back then. So much so that as soon as Camila left the country, she immediately showed up in front of him, and charmed him so much that they had that night together. With George, she became Mrs. Hans as she wished. So this time, he would surely teach Lucia a most severe lesson. He would let her know what it meant to be extremely regretful. When Hans' lawyer called, Stephen was tirelessly pestering me, trying to prove that he wasn't all show and no substance. Miss Lucia, Mr. Hans asked me to inform you that the divorce procedures will be handled in Beijing the day after tomorrow. When the lawyer's cold and polite voice came through, I just felt that the last big stone in my heart suddenly dropped. Okay, please tell Mr. Hans that I'll go back to Beijing on time to handle it. After hanging up the phone, Stephen hugged me from behind. Lucia, let me go back with you. But I shook my head. This is something between me and Hans. I can handle it properly by myself. Stephen's eyes were full of worry, but Lucia, I'm really worried. I deliberately teased him. What are you worried about? Afraid that I won't be able to get divorced. Stephen suddenly smiled, but the smile was indescribably broken. Lucia, you have no idea how much it hurt me when I heard that you were with Hans back then. But I'll never force you or compel you. You are free. That night when I said I wanted you to be responsible for me, you don't really have to take it seriously. Even if you don't take responsibility for me, it's okay. I turned around and hugged him, tilted my face up and gently kissed him. But Stephen, I've been so happy with you these days. And just now, you made me feel really good. I gently bit his chin. I'll be responsible for you. Wait for me to come back. Stephen's always gentle and calm eyes suddenly seemed like stars had fallen into them. Lucia. He turned over and pinned me on the bed, his deep and mellow voice ringing in my ear. I can make you feel even better. Does that mean you'll never want to leave me in this lifetime? I couldn't help but laugh, but I was almost knocked apart by him. Physiological tears welled up in the corners of my eyes, with a layer of moisture. Stephen. He lowered his head and kissed me gently. In the second month after our marriage, one of Hans' best friends suddenly called me. Sister-in-law, are you convenient now? What's the matter? Well, sister-in-law, Hans invited a few of us friends to drink tonight. He's drunk now. Even when he's drunk, he refuses to let us take him back. You can call the Hans family or ask Camila to pick him up. I took a glance at the closed bathroom door and gently interrupted. Sister-in-law. Hans won't allow it. Just now, he suddenly called out your name. I just found it funny. If I hadn't divorced him. If Camila weren't single now, the name he would have called should be Camila's. There are some men who seem to always only love the woman who has left them. I interrupted my friend. Please call me Lucia from now on. Also, I've already divorced Hans, so his affairs are none of my business anymore. After saying that, I hung up the phone directly without waiting for the person on the other end to say anything else. As soon as I hung up the phone, Stephen came out of the bathroom. Whose call was it? He just asked casually. I also replied indifferently, it was someone unimportant. As I said that, I smoothly picked up a towel to dry him off. But Stephen took it from my hand. You don't need to do these things. It's not tiring anyway. He dried his hair in a few strokes and smiled at me. Even so, you don't need to do anything when you're with me. But he was very patient in drying my long hair for me every day. Don't you find it annoying? Stephen turned on the medium warm air setting. Hearing my question, he just looked at me gently. I'm not the kind of person who doesn't appreciate what I have. Honey. I couldn't help but turn around and hug him, tilting my face up for him to kiss me. Stephen lowered his head and kissed me, but then stopped himself restrained. Wait until your hair is dry, or you'll get a headache. I gave him a teasing look and couldn't help but touch his hard abdominal muscles. Only you would be able to wait at a time like this. After our honeymoon, Stephen and I went back to Beijing together. Except for our closest family members and best friends, not many people in Beijing knew about our marriage. And we also planned to hold a wedding in Beijing. After all, both Stephen's and my families are here. The next time I saw Hans was at an elder's birthday banquet. That elder didn't have a particularly close relationship with my family, but had a very good relationship with Stephen's parents. So Stephen took me to attend it together. Just as we entered, Stephen was called away by the elder. Since he had been abroad for many years, he was naturally considered a rare guest. I went to the buffet table to get some small cakes. When I turned around, I saw Hans and George. The father and son were dressed identically, with the same little faces. They were quite cute. When George saw me, his eyes immediately lit up. He even subconsciously called out, "Mom," and was about to come towards me. But after taking just 2 steps, he seemed to remember something and stopped awkwardly. Hans still had an expressionless face, but the corners of his mouth were tense. I nodded at them, suppressing the slight sadness in my heart, and was about to turn around and leave. But Hans suddenly walked over. "Lucia." He looked at me for a while before speaking again. "Since you're back in Beijing, come and live in the Hans family mansion. George misses you very much." I was quite surprised. Live in the Hans family mansion? Hans coughed lightly and turned his face away, his voice a bit unnatural. "After all, you are George's biological mother. He's not even 6 years old yet and really needs his mother's care. Hans, we're already divorced." I frowned and was about to turn around and leave again. "Lucia, Camila has gone back to the United States." Hans suddenly grabbed me and said this baffling ly. "What does it have to do with me?" I shook off his hand and took a step back. "How could it have nothing to do with you?" He frowned. "Weren't you angry and wanted a divorce back then because of Camila? Now that she's gone, you should have calmed down. If you come back now, I'm not saying I won't consider remarrying you. After all, no matter what, you are George's biological mother. It's better than having an outsider." "Hans, do I need to be any clearer? When I divorced you, I never thought of getting back together with you again." "Lucia, I'm giving you a chance here. I don't need it." I really couldn't help it anymore. I raised my hand to show him. "Hans, I'm married." The wedding ring on my ring finger was shining with a low-key yet dazzling brilliance. Hans' black eyes narrowed, and his face suddenly turned cold and gloomy. But in an instant, he looked at me and smiled faintly again. "Lucia, you really don't need to do this. I also said that if you want to remarry, I'm not saying I won't consider it." "You say you're married. Where's your husband then?" "I don't think that after being married and having a child, you can find a better man than me. What's more, you loved me." He said it so surely, sure that since I loved him once, I would always love him. Sure that I was secretly longing to remarry him but was too shy to say so. Sure that as long as he beckoned, I would shamelessly go back to him. But he didn't know. Actually, I didn't even know myself. Maybe the so-called love I had for him had a crack on the night he forced himself on me when he was drunk. Later, the main reason I agreed to marry him was probably because of George. Just like in the end when I made up my mind to divorce him, it was also because of George. Once, the child was the reason that bound my happiness and freedom, but now, nothing can bind me anymore. Hans, although you're a CEO type, the world you live in isn't a CEO romance novel. I kindly advised him, "You might as well find the time to get a brain CT scan and have a good look at your brain." Just as I finished speaking, I saw Stephen walking quickly towards us. He was wearing a complete set of black business suit, looking noble and handsome. He also had a wedding ring on his left ring finger, which was a matching pair with mine. "Lucia." He called my name softly. He walked up to me and naturally intertwined his fingers with mine. The matching rings on our hands shone brightly together. making Hans' lonely Bulgari wedding ring on his hand look ridiculously out of place. Honey, I'm a bit hungry. Could you get me that small cake? I want the mango one. Stephen pinched my face. Okay, but don't eat too many sweets, or your teeth will hurt. He turned around to get a plate and get the cake for me. But Hans suddenly reached out and knocked the plate out of his hand in a rather unseemly manner. Stephen frowned unhappily and looked up. President Hans, what are you doing? You must be hired by Lucia, right? You look quite presentable. Hans looked him up and down and sneered. Lucia is my ex-wife. She gave birth to a son for me. Are you sure you want to pick up the woman I don't want? The air around us suddenly became deathly silent. Although I didn't care about my past, being publicly ridiculed by Hans like this in public still inevitably made me feel a bit embarrassed. Stephen didn't say anything. Even the expression on his face didn't change a bit. He just turned around and walked up to me, took off the watch I gave him, and then took off his wedding ring and handed them to me. Lucia, hold these for me. I don't want to get them dirty. I took them without understanding. Stephen, what are you going to do? Lucia, wait for me for 5 minutes. He lowered his eyes and rolled up his sleeves a little. He walked up to Hans and punched him in the face. I don't like to hit people, but Hans, you asked for this. As he spoke, he landed another heavy punch. You shouldn't have humiliated my wife. Hans quickly regained his senses and started to fight back. Your wife? Lucia was married to me for 5 years and gave birth to a child for me. What kind of wife is she to you? Need I remind you that you two are already divorced? Divorced or not, how much Lucia loves me, you might as well ask her. Enough. I was both heartbroken and angry and impatient. I pushed Hans away and stood in front of Stephen to protect him. Hans, I don't love you anymore. Did you hear that clearly? What did you say? Hans looked at me with cold and gloomy eyes. Lucia, say that again if you dare. Hans, I stopped loving you a long time ago. Maybe from the moment you forced yourself on me when you were drunk, I didn't like you anymore. Then why did you accept my proposal? Why did you marry me? Hans sneered. Lucia, you're just fickle. You've changed your heart. You don't even want your own child. How long do you think this man will like you? Why can't I change my heart? Hans, haven't you changed your heart too? You liked Camila, but had a one-night stand with me. You married me but slept with Camila. What kind of behavior is that? I didn't sleep with Camila. Lucia, after I married you, I never had any relationship with Camila. Hans looked at me and suddenly laughed sarcastically. I admit that when Camila came back, I was a bit distracted. But that night, in the end, when I thought of you, I left her house. I was a bit surprised. But other than that, I didn't have any other extra emotions. Whether he and Camila had gone all the way or not, it really didn't matter anymore. Even if they hadn't, I would still have firmly divorced him. Enough, Hans. All these things are in the past. I'm married. I love my husband very much. I turned around and tightly grasped Stephen's hand. We're doing great, very much in love. You, too, should look forward. What about George? You gave birth to him after carrying him for 10 months. Don't you want him anymore? Hans' eyes were very red. He was like a spoiled child who finally realized he was about to be abandoned and was scared. My vision also became a bit blurry. But still, I nodded. Yes, I don't want him anymore. Actually, if that day George had given me a chocolate, perhaps I would still have been reluctant to let him go and would have fought for his custody regardless of everything. Maybe I would have softened my heart again and again. But when George walked around me and slammed the door and left, my heart truly died. Hans turned around and pulled George to walk away. But George suddenly burst into tears and broke free from his hand. I don't want to go with you. I want Mommy. Mommy, I won't play games anymore. I know I was wrong. Please come back. George ran over and grabbed my hand tightly, refusing to let go. I can't deny that I still felt sad and heartbroken. But I also knew that I would never forget that day for the rest of my life. When I was at my most helpless, my child turned around and left so coldly and selfishly. What if I hadn't managed to get through that? What if I had died like that? George, go back with your dad. Whether you're a child or an adult, you always have to be responsible for your own choices. No, I won't go back. Mommy, I want to be with you. I don't want to be separated from you. George kept crying and fussing. It seemed that he was really scared and knew he was wrong. Because on that day, when he was sick and in the hospital, it was Camila who took care of him. But when he fell asleep, he was woken up by the sound of Camila on the phone. He heard Camila say, "Why should I take care of someone else's child here instead of my own? If it weren't for a smooth divorce, how could I possibly please this annoying child? George is so stupid too. He even said I was nicer to him than Lucia. It's hilarious. Which mother doesn't love her own flesh and blood more than someone else's? Well, it's good that he's a bit stupid. If I really marry Hans in the future, with him being so stupid, there will be one less rival for my child." Actually, he didn't quite understand. After all, these topics were too profound for a 5-year-old. But he did understand one sentence. Which mother doesn't love her own flesh and blood more than someone else's? Yes, a biological mother is always better than a stepmother. It seemed that from that day on, he gradually understood some things. And slowly remembered my kindness too, but it was such a pity. It was too late. If your dad agrees, I'll come back to see you too. If you miss me, you can come to see me too. But now, I'm sorry, George. I'm going to start my own life. I touched his little face and said the same thing as when we parted last time. Good luck, George. Stephen and I held a wedding in Beijing. On the wedding day, both Hans and George came. But I didn't let the two of them in. Hans sent a very expensive gift. Stephen didn't accept it and had it sent directly to a charity foundation. George also prepared a gift for me. It was a handicraft he made by himself, along with a card that I kept the card and gave the handicraft to a child I liked. I heard that on that day, Hans' Rolls-Royce parked outside the wedding venue for a long time and didn't leave. I also heard that after Stephen took me home, that Rolls-Royce seemed to have followed us to our wedding house, but our wedding house was a private villa, and his car couldn't get in. When we were in the bridal chamber, at the most passionate moment, Stephen suddenly whispered in my ear, "Lucia, do you think he'd be insanely jealous if he were outside right now?" I kicked him in annoyance. "What a strange taste you have, Stephen." Stephen grasped my ankle and pushed it up little by little. He leaned down and kissed me deeply, because during those thousands of days and nights before, I was also insanely jealous like this. Stephen. I felt a bit sorry for him and couldn't help but hug him tightly, but he then gently kissed my ear. "But not anymore. Lucia, from now on, it'll be Hans who's jealous. And I'll make him jealous for his whole life, including the next life."